let's talk about floating structures or shapes in ATAK. The first thing we want to know is how do we create a floating structure, and it's actually quite simple. We go to our shapes tool and we go to our drawings and we can pick any of the shapes that we have, and if we input a shape into ATAK, we have it in a circle and in a rectangle and a square and all that stuff, right? But if we want to make this thing float, we can actually give it an altitude. So if we go over here, you'll notice that the center point of this shape, that's the location of it, that's the MGRS grid, but then we also have the elevation here is listed at 685 foot MSL. So an important point to know here is that when we want to increase the altitude of this shape, we're dealing with already 685. So if we want this to be at 1,000 feet MSL, we can't simply put in 1,000 foot MSL, because what this is going to do is it's only going to raise us about 400 feet off the deck, right? So instead, what we need to do is go down to 1,600 foot MSL. And what that's going to do is that's going to actually raise it to the proper altitude that we want. Now, check this out. The other important thing is that number that I just inputted there, all that does is it changes the height of the epicenter of that shape, right? So you can notice where that little dot is. We can change it to different colors, but where that little dot is, all that does is change that height of that dot. I mean, we could go up to here and let's give it, an altitude of 20,000 foot MSL. So the shape is still planted on the deck. It's still on the ground, right? Now the dot has risen to 20,000 foot MSL, main sea level. Now, how do we bring this height up to it? So if you notice, when we go to height on the interface over here, if we go to height, if we actually just put a negative value, you can put like -1, for example, this will actually trick the system into expanding it from the ground, from the deck, all the way up to that point there. So that's the height. A negative value, -1, negative whatever. So that's just something to be aware of, right? Now, the next thing I want to discuss here is, well, but that's all great, but we want this thing to be floating. Well, what we do there is now we're going to give it a positive value. So let's say we give it a height of 500 feet, and we click OK. And now let's zoom underneath it. So now we have a 500 foot circle that's underneath that point where that epicenter is, right? So if we want to increase it, we can go up to, let's say, 10,000 feet. And now we have 10,000 foot from where the epicenter of that circle is all the way down. So I've shown you how to do this with a circle, but we can also do this with other shapes as well. So if we want to go, for example, let's try a square. We can take this square and we can do the same thing. Let's go 6,000 foot MSL. So that's a very important key point that I just want to reiterate again. Don't think just because you're putting in your elevation here, understand that this is foot MSL. So don't understand that if you want something at, you want something 1,000 feet off the ground, above ground level, for example, this isn't AGL. So if you put in an input 1,000, this is 1,000 foot MSL. It's not AGL. So it's a very key point to understand, right? So let's go back up here. Now we've risen it up, but we're still clamped to the ground, right? So we can go down, maybe give it a depth of 2,000 feet or whatever. So there. And that is our square. Now we can also do this with a polygon as well. So if all these are polygons, right? But if we go to the multi-polygon, or what ATAK calls a multi-point polygon, I can make this polygon and I can have it, I can actually symbolize, if I really wanted to, this is how I would actually recreate some of the no-fly zones, well, not the no-fly zones, but the different airspaces that are depicted on this map here. So if I go to my drawing tools, I can actually, somewhat recreate it. And now I want it to float. And I'm going to give it the center 500 foot MSL. I'm going to give it 10,000 foot MSL. And let's give it some depth. Maybe we have 3,000 feet. And now it takes a little bit to go through, but if you'll notice, now we have our polygon, our shaped polygon, now floating in space, as it were, in the air, and that could signify our restricted airspace or anything of that matter. And then we can also give it a name. So if we want to type in here, shape name, restricted. There we go. Thanks for tuning in.